Good morning. You're all, I'm sure, wondering why I'm wearing this today. Short answer is that my daughter and I will be heading to the Cubs Cards game right after church this morning. So if I haven't totally lost my voice here after preaching 4 times, I'll go lose it there, yelling at the Cubs, I'm sure. But the long answer is that today's message is about hope. And as a lifelong Cubs fan, I have learned a lot about hope. Anyway, a big welcome to you, regardless of whether you're a Cubs fan or you're wagging your finger at me or going like this as a Cardinal fan, or whether you're no fan at all, which is fine by me. And a special welcome to those of you who are online also. Glad to have you this holiday weekend. My name's Andy. We are in the last couple weeks of our guided tour of some of the Bible's most essential passages. And to these last few weeks, we've been focusing on God's transforming power to make all things new. And we're going to wrap things up next week with God completing his work of making all things new. And we'll be in the book of Revelation for that. And next week will be also our final week of our current worship schedule. And then, if you haven't heard already, we will be beginning September 18th, moving to 2 worship services, 9 a.m. traditional here in the sanctuary, and 10:30 modern in the Family Life Center. So this will be the last Sunday that I won't be able to be a part of the end of the worship service up here. So especially with communion, I very much miss sharing that with this worship service. So this will be the last time. Talk about God making all things new. I love that. But each service will be live streamed, so you can join online also, and there'll be nursery and children's ministry available for each. But for now, if you have your Bible with you, or even if you don't, just grab the Bible in the pew back in front of you and open up to the book of 1 Peter, if you will. It's in the way back. If you have gotten to the book of Revelation or the index, you've gone too far. But as you're looking for it, as you're doing that, let me give you just a little bit of background about the author of this letter. You see, it's called 1 Peter because, Peter wrote it. In fact, we read that right off the bat in verse 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect. And then he shares who he's writing it to. But this is the same Peter who we learn about in the accounts of Jesus' life. Same Peter. The Peter who was the fisherman. Peter who came to Jesus on invitation of his brother Andrew. Same Peter who Jesus said these words to. He said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you to become a fisher of people." Peter, whose name used to be Simon, but Jesus renamed him Peter, which means the rock, and later told him, "You, Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the powers of hell will not conquer it." From what we learn in the Bible, Peter had a lot going for him. He was the outspoken leader amongst Jesus' disciples. He was bold enough to step out of the boat in the middle of a raging storm on the Sea of Galilee because he saw Jesus walking on water. He was also wise and discerning enough to recognize Jesus for who he really was. He was the first one to do so. He said, "You are the Son of God, the Messiah." And Peter was full of faith. He was probably the most famous of the disciples and the one we each most like to associate with when we read the Scriptures. At least until we get to the ways that Peter failed. Right? And when he failed big time. I mean, if Peter was a baseball player, he's the kind of guy who he'd get up to bat and you knew one of 2 things were going to happen. He'd launch one out of the park, or he would look horrible striking out miserably. He was all or nothing in many ways. And many of you know some of the ways that Peter struck out. On the last night of Jesus' life, Jesus, when he was sharing the Last Supper with his disciples, Jesus told all of his disciples that they would fall away from him. To which Peter piped up and said, Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. And Jesus then predicted that Peter would deny even knowing him. Not just once, but 3 times. To which Peter again responded, saying, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. But of course, later that night when Jesus needed Peter the most, he fell asleep while praying. And then he ran away from Jesus' trial, denying that he knew Jesus 3 different times just to save his own skin. Peter's failure was so significant that even after Jesus died, Peter didn't consider himself a disciple any longer. You know, it's my belief that Peter is one of the Bible's absolute best every person. You know what I mean? Where in other words, when we see Peter, each and every one of us can see in him part of ourselves. Isn't that the case for you when you think about Peter? I mean, there are times, I am sure, when you exhibit tremendous faith. I've seen it. When you're strong, when you're bold, when you stand up for what is right, when you trust God when nobody else does, leaping into the water and just running toward Jesus wholeheartedly. Then there are the other times, the times that you don't normally talk about, certainly don't post about on Facebook. The times when, if they were broadcast for the world to see, like Peter's failures were, that you would be broken and ashamed and absolutely humiliated. You and I, you see, we're mixed bags. We have, by God's grace, the potential to do great, great things, to follow God in ways that inspire all the people around us. But we also have the capacity to wound others, to abandon God, and generally just to make a mess out of every good thing that God has entrusted to us in our lives. I wonder what kind of season I've caught you in today. Let's assume for a moment that I've caught you during a bad stretch, maybe a slump. Maybe you feel like you've let God down. Maybe you've been stuck in some sort of a sin that you can't get out of. Maybe you've hurt people close to you, said or done some things that you wish that you could take back. Maybe I've caught you in a place where you're feeling like the guilt in your life is pretty thick. Maybe similar even to Peter's after abandoning Jesus, where he recognized his own failures, where he was broken and without hope. If you're in that place, I want you to take encouragement from these words that God inspired Peter to write several years after his stunning failure. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. You hear that, right? This is Peter. Peter, the one who failed Jesus. You see, one of the great things that we can learn from Peter's life is that no matter how low you get, no matter how far down into the pit you've gone, you're never out of God's reach. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope. When you turn to Jesus, even in the midst of your brokenness and failure, there is forgiveness and grace and mercy, and God gives you new birth into a living hope. And just like Peter, you and I desperately need this living hope. Why? Well, in short, we are let down over and over and over again when we put our hope in the wrong things. Take this from a Cubs fan. I know. Whether we readily admit it or not, all of us, at one time or another, have put our hope in finite things that can be lost, things that don't last. And they're not necessarily all bad things. They're just not things worthy of our ultimate hope. Things like our health, or our status and reputation, our wealth, our relationships, our successes, the dreams of our ideal future. And when we put our hope in these things and then they're stripped away, like they were for Peter, then oftentimes we find ourselves shattered and in deep despair. We need a living hope. You know, the people Peter was writing to, they needed a living hope. We'll see a little bit later in the passage that they're experiencing some pretty significant suffering. They were experiencing the suffering from because they were being persecuted for their faith. We know from just other readings of the type of persecution and suffering that they were going through, that they had probably lost their jobs, their reputations. Many of them had been ostracized by family or friends. Just think like maybe you're a part of a house divided, Cub fan, Cardinal fan in the same house. Anybody here got that? You need some support. Just imagine that, only 1,000 times worse. That kind of just being ostracized by your family or your parishioners or somebody, you know. They may have been beaten, abused, thrown into prison. Some of them were having their lives threatened. Some of them have lost their lives. Their health, wealth, their status, all stripped away. And more. Now, Pastor Tim Keller, when writing about hope, he said this. He said, there is no way to get through life unless you know how to get through suffering. And there's no way to get through suffering unless you have a living hope. We need a living hope. We need a living hope because suffering will find its way to us. Keller goes on to share, when writing about hope, about a Jewish psychologist, pretty famous, a fellow named Viktor Frankl. He survived the Holocaust even as a prisoner in the most infamous Nazi concentration camp, Auschwitz. Frankl observed through his own experience what happened when people experience extreme suffering. And he said he observed 4 different types of responses that generally occurred in people's lives. One group of people, he said, in their fight to survive, would turn and become brutal and cruel toward their fellow prisoners. He said he observed that in some people. In others, he saw they just withered, they crumbled. They lost all hope and gave up. A third group, he said, endured, believing that if they survived, then everything that they lost, all of their hopes, would be restored. But Frankl, who himself survived, observed that many of those who approached things that way fell into a deep despair after liberation because it did not meet their expectations. And some, very few, but some, retained their inner strength enough to endure, and they didn't lose their compassion and love in the process despite the cruelties that they suffered. And through it all, Frankl determined that suffering exposes people's foundations, those things that people have built their lives upon. And he said that life only has meaning if we have a hope and a meaning that suffering and even death cannot destroy. In other words, he observed that your ultimate hope determines how you live your life now and how you handle the sufferings that come your way. And if your hope is in finite things, and then they are stripped away, which they will be, for each of us, then you'll either become jaded and cruel, or give up all hope and crumble, or do all that you can to restore those things that you put your hope in, only to find that it's a futile effort and fall into despair. We need a living hope. A hope that isn't founded upon things that do not last, on things that will eventually fade or die. And in the next few verses, Peter shares that the living hope that God gives us, that it can't be lost. Listen to some of the ways that he describes this. At the beginning of verse 4, he describes this living hope as an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. That sounds pretty permanent, doesn't it? Pretty secure, something solid, something that can't be stripped away. Second half of verse 4, this inheritance is kept in heaven for you. It's kept. That means it's utterly safe and secure. It's guaranteed. Nothing can remove it. In the next verse, you'll see as it comes on the screen, verse 5, we see that this living hope, this inheritance, will be revealed in the last time. This is speaking of the time when Jesus returns, when he brings God's kingdom reign in its fullness and in its power. And we'll take a little look at that next week. But our living hope will be completely revealed to us then. And it will be kept safe for us until then. But what is it? What is this living hope? And what difference does it make in our lives right now? If it's not going to be revealed until then, what difference does it make for us now? Well, I think these next two verses help to answer that question. First, that question, what does this living hope do for us now? Well, verse 6, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. It begins, in all this you greatly rejoice. Well, what is all this? Well, you just look at the previous couple of verses. It's talking about the living hope. The inheritance that is kept safe for us until it's finally revealed. Peter is writing this to Christians who, according to verse 2, were exiles. They were scattered about. They were being persecuted. They were throughout southern Europe, Western Asia. And he says here in verse 6, he says that they presently, it's a present tense, they're presently rejoicing in this living hope. Even though, also again, present tense, they are presently suffering grief and all kinds of trials. Now, that doesn't, it would make more sense, right, if he says, oh, well, you were rejoicing in this great hope in Jesus Christ. Oh, but then these trials and sufferings came and you're not rejoicing anymore. That's not what it says. They're both present tense. The rejoicing and the suffering are happening simultaneously. And this just blows our minds. Right? This just blows people's minds. It doesn't make sense. It's so contrary to the way most people approach life. And how is this even possible? Well, you might say, oh, well, the sufferings must not be that great. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Remember, their lives were being threatened. Some of their lives had been lost. These early Christians, they were losing everything. Furthermore, the Greek word here used for suffer grief is the same word attributed to Jesus' suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane. Same word. When Jesus said there in the garden that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. This was no light suffering. And yet, Peter says that because of this living hope, these Christians were rejoicing even in the midst of great suffering. And folks, that's what a living hope does. Imagine it this way. Think about it like this. Imagine the absolute worst job you could possibly have. I don't know what it would be for you. What came to my mind? Oh, a couple things came to my mind. I'm a little claustrophobic, so like a coal miner, like that can, that's not a job that I would want. Or maybe a toll booth collector. I always try to smile when I drive through any kind of toll booth. I think, what a miserable job. So those things first came to my mind. I don't know what would come to your mind. But imagine the worst job you could possibly have. And now imagine that you have to work that job 80 hours every week. And you're only getting paid $30,000 a year. What do you think your attitude would be like? Not very good, huh? No way. No way. That sounds, in some cases, like a definition of hell. No way. I mean, you'd probably quit pretty quickly. Now imagine, same job, same hours, but that somebody's paying you $30 million a year to do that job. Think your attitude would be a little bit different? Think that might make a difference? That's what a living hope does. It gives you such an amazing future to anticipate that no circumstances can steal your joy in the midst. No sorrow, no pain can take away your hope-filled future. When you have a living hope, you can simultaneously rejoice even in the midst of real and deep sorrow. Now, don't get me wrong, having a living hope doesn't mean you disregard sorrow and pain. No, not at all. In fact, I think having a living hope allows you to no longer deny grief and suffering that is a part of your experience. Because when you have a living hope, you can actually acknowledge it and not deny it, because you're looking forward to something that is so much greater that suffering can't blemish it, can't take it away. In fact, the next verse seems to indicate that the suffering actually makes your joy stronger. Verse 7, these sufferings have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. The sufferings refine your joy. Just like fire refines fire. Fire refines gold. It burns out the impurities. It makes it stronger. And can you imagine living your life that way? Can you imagine having your heart so captivated by a living hope that you not only rejoice in the midst of suffering, but that your joy actually grows? It actually gets stronger when suffering finds you. But in this verse, we also finally see what the living hope is. What inheritance is kept safe? What will be revealed? I hope you see it here. These sufferings have come so that your faith may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. This verse is saying that your living hope, that which strengthens you so that you can endure any circumstance, is that when Jesus Christ is revealed and you are with Him, you will receive praise, glory, and honor from Him. You sure about that, Pastor? How can that be? I mean, isn't Jesus the only one who is worthy of praise, glory, and honor? Well, yes. Yes. But that's the beauty of the gospel. Jesus on the cross took the death that you and I deserve for our sin, and in return gives us His inheritance. the praise, glory, and honor that He deserves. By our faith, which is proven and refined through suffering, we can receive new birth into a living hope, a promise that when Jesus is revealed, we will be welcomed by Him with praise, glory, and honor. How amazing is that? Receiving praise and honor from the Lord of the universe, our Savior, instead of the condemnation that we deserve. That's the gospel. That's the good news. And don't you dare forget who that message is coming from. No, not from me. It's coming from Peter. Peter, the one who denied Jesus, who when he saw suffering in his future, fled to save his own skin, who didn't endure. And yet Jesus, He came for Peter. He came for him. He pursued him. After His resurrection, Jesus found Peter, offered him forgiveness and grace, and gave him new birth into a living hope. Don't miss that, folks. Don't miss it. Just like Jesus sought Peter out after Jesus was raised from the dead, I believe Jesus is seeking you out. Not to condemn you, not to remind you of the ways that you've screwed up. No. Out of His great love for you, Jesus is seeking you out to restore you, to give you a living hope that will sustain you through any circumstance that this life throws at you. A living hope that is kept safe for you, that cannot be taken, and that will result in the embrace of your Savior and sharing in His praise, glory, and honor. Friends, I don't know all the circumstances of your life right now. I don't know if you're struggling to endure or if you're finding it rather easy right now. I don't know all the sufferings and trials that you are going through. I know some, but I don't know them all. But I do know that the gift that God has offered you, the gift of new birth into a living hope, surpasses everything else. It is worth so much more than anything else in this world. And how do you receive it? Well, let's look at how those Peter wrote to received it. Verses 8 and 9. Though you have not seen Him, you love Him. And even though you do not see Him now, you believe in Him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. For you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. How do you receive it? Well, this is some of what I see. You love Jesus. You believe in Him, even though you don't see Him. You believe in His resurrection and His authority, and you have faith in Him. And the result is the salvation of your soul, a new birth into a living hope that is kept safe for you no matter what circumstances come your way until Jesus comes again and welcomes us with praise, glory, and honor that we do not deserve, and yet He offers freely. If you want that living hope today, then you can receive it as we celebrate Holy Communion as a church family. Like I said, I won't be sharing that with you today, but that is the last time that I won't be. So in this holy meal, truly we remember Jesus' suffering. And I want you to think about this. What was Jesus' living hope when He endured the cross? Well, it's not so much the same as ours. I mean, ours is that we'll be embraced by Him with the glory and honor and praise that He deserves. It wasn't that glory, honor, and praise. He already had that. But the part of that equation He didn't have is us. Jesus' living hope was the salvation of your soul and mine. He endured the cross out of His great love for you.